I'm ready. Are you ready, Resident 5?
No, I'm not. We might leave that in. All right. How's
Okay.
it going, Tannah?
It's going good. How about you, Holly?
I'm good. Another busy weekend over here. I don't know how it's going for you.
Yeah, it was a busy weekend, but we're gonna be making a leprechaun trap today. So
Oh,
that's
that
the
sounds fun.
exciting things in my house. And Keegan went for the glitter when we were at Target getting the supplies. I'm like, no shot. That's where I draw the line.
Oh, that's funny.
Yeah. We're talking
Hmm.
5 today.
We're talking fives today. Before we start talking fives, just a reminder, our podcast is called Enneagram Adventure. Tannah and I are both IEQ 9 certified coaches with that Enneagram tool and assessment. Both Tannah and I have gotten a lot of value, both personally, and then also we've seen the value in other people's lives in terms of learning the Enneagram and developing self-awareness around it. And so thus the podcast to try to share a little bit more about it through our lens. And today we're talking fives, and I am the resident five.
I'm
Oh,
so excited. I'm
yeah.
excited for you. This is gonna be great.
We'll see. So just a reminder on the Enneagram, Tannah, don't let me miss anything on this, but what makes the Enneagram different from maybe other personality assessments out there is it's really looking to identify a core motivation for people. Motivations are generally, the core motivations are generally developed early in childhood, and it becomes kind of a pattern that you just repeat throughout your life until you develop some awareness around it or decide it's not working anymore and you want to find your way out of the box that you put yourself in, and the Enneagram can be a tool to help you. So, fives, their motivation is a lot around independence. The way that they're gathering or getting that independence, though, has to do with like knowledge that's collected. It's this motivation to know a lot of things, and that when you know a lot of things, the knowing of the things is what keeps you safe. So, a lot of fives can be studious, read a lot, listen to a lot, but it's in this sort of they're solving their anxiety through knowledge. That does resonate with me. They also will go super deep down rabbit holes on different topics, and we'll get into more examples of that. Enneagram fives are sometimes called the observer or the investigator. The IEQ 9 calls them the quiet specialist.
What's your
Not my,
favorite?
I prefer observer or investigator to quiet specialist. They're all fitting in different ways, of course.
Yeah. I don't think it's fair to necessarily categorize all fives as quiet. That's the
Right.
reason I ask. I don't think that's a
Yeah.
fair assessment. Well, I'm excited to dig into this with you as our resident 5, and I have a lot of questions, but
Great.
mostly being, how do you feel about that?
All right, too. The thing that's interesting, and we will do a whole podcast on the head, heart, and gut centers of the Enneagram, but the fives sit in the head triad with their friends, the sixes and sevens. They tend to be more in their head than in their feelings. And I definitely resonate with that. And when I think about how I ended up a five in my childhood in the house that I grew up in, what was rewarded or what was punished or whatever, which, as we've talked about on previous podcasts with other numbers, right, that's often how this is formed, as you as a child develop this strategy to keep yourself safe or perceived safe, emotionally safe in your household, maybe sometimes physically safe. For me, the fiveness was out of safety, but also we were rewarded for being smart. Like the books we read, the papers we wrote, the math problems we solved, those things were rewarded and valued as I was growing up by my mom and my stepdad. So that also doubles down into that fiveness of like needing to learn a lot, needing to know a lot of things, needing to be able to recite or regurgitate the things that you know. I think that showed up for me. I spend a lot of time in my head. The other thing I will say about being a very heady number who doesn't spend a lot of time I do very regular personal development work to get into my feelings because it's not the easiest, and it's common for fives to mistake thoughts for feelings or feelings for thought. Like they intellectualize the feeling so quickly and turn it into a thought instead of an actual feeling. And that definitely can happen for me. You just sort of bypass the feeling and it goes straight into a logical thing. And sometimes it's not always
So,
logical, but that's like how it
yeah.
translates.
So, in talking about and hearing about how you became a five and what was rewarded, can you think of a time that you didn't have the answer or you didn't have the knowledge that would have made you feel safe? And does anything stick out to you as far as something you would want to share of what happens to you when you don't have that as a mechanism of defense and comfort?
Uh, I would say this is how fives get the quiet specialist title, is that when I don't have the answer, it tends to be a shutdown moment of being like, well, I don't know anything about that. So I either have nothing to add, there's no value for me to give. So I say nothing. Or it could be the panic of, I should know, I should have known. Why didn't I do XYZ research ahead of time? And then again, there can be kind of a quiet thing. Sometimes that can feel, just to identify what it could feel like, sometimes that can feel like anxiety. Depending on the situation, too, my mind might go blank if I'm trying to grasp for something. Like, I think I know a little about that, but I can't put my finger on it exactly, that I kind of will go blank. I think for me, the five that I just gave the reward side of
Hmm.
this, but I grew up in kind of through a tumultuous childhood. So there was also some things where the fiveness was out of necessity. If I was quiet, that sort of kept me out of the line of fire in some ways. That makes a kid who stays quiet a lot, and that's the safe place for them, they spend a lot of time in their own head. And that's some of how the five develops too, is there's something in the world or something in their life that feels intrusive, and it's safe in their own brain. So they just retreat into that space. So I lived as a child a life with a lot of sort of imagination,
Sure.
right? And that was the safe, like, retreat into your own head, be quiet, think, imagine things, like make up your own stories, make up like that kind of
Sure.
thing.
So I am like wrapping my head around what it would feel like to have to kind of garner like all of this knowledge and all of this like logic and support and ideas and everything else. And I'm like, damn, do you ever get tired of that? Is there ever fatigue that comes from that? And then if so, what happens for you?
That's a hard question. I think it depends. If I am, like, in my life now, if I'm learning something that I want to learn, that's my choice, I'm interested in it, I have a passion for it, or I'm curious about it, no. Like, we'll spend hours and hours trying to learn all the things that I can learn about whatever the subject is. The example of that I share often when I teach the Enneagram and we talk about fives is when I worked for the winemaker and I wanted to learn everything there was to know about making wine. So I made Aaron, my husband, plant a vineyard so that I could learn how to make wine from vine to bottle, like the whole thing. That was very fun and was not exhausting in any way to like go down all of the rabbit hole, learn all of the things, versus when you're sort of forced into something. Even though I was a five, I was rewarded for being smart, for writing papers, for all that sort of thing. I did not like school. And I did not like sort of being forced into, you have to learn this or choose this path. So I struggled with like academic institution and got fed up with, when I was in college, I got fed up with that whole process and
Could
sort of
that
all
be
the rules around it.
could that be also the independence thing as a five for you, where it's like don't force that on me? Or does
Yeah, I think
independence translate differently for you?
I think it depends. Well, I think every 5 that would be a different question. For me,
That's
the
fair.
independence is in the I want to find ways to take care of myself so that I don't have to be super dependent on anyone else. That doesn't even saying it like that doesn't really accurately describe it. But it's sort of the independence in terms of I can figure it out. Like I'll figure it out. I don't need to necessarily ask for help. I'll figure it out. I don't know if that's making sense, but that's sort of how I operate. Because when it comes to the day to day, this is like the joke now. I mean, I'm 42. And if something happened to my husband, like I wouldn't eat. Like I'd go to like all boxed dinners. And so it's not fully that I'm like complete, like I don't depend on someone else
Yeah.
in that way. And there's like other stuff behind that. So I want to paint that picture accurately. Yes, I have some dependence on other people, but then there's always this sort of part of me that's like, well, I'll figure it out myself.
Well, the other thing that I've heard you talk about before is this notion of energy conservation as it relates to emotions. Can you talk a little bit about what that means for a 5 in terms of like protecting that emotional energy and expense? Because I know that's part of it for 5s, right? They really want to protect and conserve that.
Yes. It's a big so I've heard it described in different ways, but for 5s, it's like they start the day with a full battery, and every interaction that they have throughout the day takes a little bit of that battery down. So it's just a little like every day. And the goal for the 5 is to make it home before the battery runs out. That is sort of true for me. Without deep diving on subtypes, I'm a 1-to-1 5, which is the counter type of 5. So my 5-ness doesn't show up quite like that. While I identify as an introvert, there are certain people, certain activities that involve other people that I actually find energizing. So that's not 100% true for me.
Got it.
But the energy conservation is well, we talked about it I think on the 2 when we talked about you. I text back, generally
Oh, yeah.
speaking, very short text messages. And that's a conservation of energy. I don't want to put a whole lot of extra fluff into the messaging. So if you ask me a question and I reply yes, no, okay, that's like a energy conservation for me. I'm not gonna fluff it up. And every once in a while I have to be careful because I can do the thing where I'll even call somebody. This happened recently where I called somebody and I just immediately dove into like the reason I called. And then I was like, oh wait, sorry. Hi, how are you? How are your kids?
My God,
Like,
hi.
yeah. Yeah. Oops. So sorry. Uh,
It's so funny because, like, in my
yeah.
passive aggressive tuness, when people do that to me, sometimes I will respond with good morning or like
Yeah.
afternoon.
And I'm just trying to like get through it
You're just
with the
like,
least amount of energy possible,
yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah,
Yes. I think that's part of it, in the energy conservation is to try to keep in interactions to the point, to
yeah.
try to not fluff it up. I know I'm not alone as a 5 in this, but I cannot stand small talk. Can't. If that just if there's interactions that I find particularly draining, it's the small talk. How's the weather? How's your mom? How's your blah blah blah? That sort of thing. I just I can't. I'll lose my shit sometimes. And sometimes it's just in my head. So I'm
You're
just
like,
like,
oh
"Oh
my
my."
God, I want to be anywhere else but here right
Yes.
now.
Yes. And it isn't that I'm not interested in other people's lives, but let's talk about something real. Tell me about
Right.
the goal that you're pursuing. Tell me about the project you're working on, the work that you're doing. Let's not beat around the bush about, you know, wow, it sure was cold this weekend or
Thank
whatever,
you. That
right?
really adds to my emotional energy for you to talk about. I think
Uh,
the other thing about 5s, I love that they have this, but you guys are the best listeners that I've ever had the pleasure of knowing. And that means a lot for me as a verbal processor and a 2 that is an oversharer, right? So I think it's very comforting to have a 5 in your life that you can just go to and be like, I have this thing, even if it's really, it doesn't have to be negative. It can be super exciting. And you have a 5 that's going to listen and talk through and actually really actively listen. And not every number has that same authentic ability to actively listen.
Well, I think that's where the observer thing starts to come in too for 5s. Because, and what's interesting is that there is I'm not always active listening, by the way.
You just read that way.
Yes. Depending on the person, yes. Most of the time I try very hard to stay actively engaged in the conversation. But depending on the person or the situation or what it might be, there are times where like I will go back into my own brain and actually not be like I'm physically present, but I am not there. And I think 5s are just really
I think I've only seen you do that a few times. You always have the best questions, and maybe that's why I perceive it that way, where it's like the questions that you ask around a statement or even if it's a belief that I have, or I think this is what's happening here. You're really good at, that for sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
Sure that's not a story you're telling yourself.
Like, it's true.
Yeah, I think that what's interesting about, and everybody perceives the questions differently. And I know there can be a different tone to this, but I talk about sometimes in conflict situations, 5s typically have a conflict style that is methodical, is what they call it. It's around, you come up against a problem and it sort of becomes like a list of how to get through the problem of like logical things. And so a personal example I'll use is my husband got laid off at the end of last year or whatever, fall. I guess it wasn't the end of last year, but and we're fine. He found another job. So that's whatever. This is just an example of like how my brain works when you're sent into this is the problem. And so I was like, oh, problem is we now have to make up this much income. How can we, and it was immediately through the lens of how do we change our lifestyle, like drop our lifestyle to solve the problem. And it became a list of like, okay, best case scenario, this, worst case scenario, this. And it's this very logical sort of way of solving the problem. And then if this will solve the problem this way, in the worst case, we didn't have to go into worst case. That's also where maybe the 6 wing can come in situations like that too.
Yeah.
But it can be even in terms of like what I have to do for something. If I have to execute a project, it sort of starts at here's the steps that are going to have to be taken in a logical way, and then that will solve the problem. Where that becomes an issue from a feeling standpoint, because I think that's where you're probably going to go, is that some things can't be solved like that. So the other thing that will happen is I will do things, and I know we've mentioned Brandon on every single podcast, but Brandon and I have worked on things like not bypassing grief. Because another example I can give is my grandma passed away in January of 2021. So we were still sort of in that peak kind of COVID weird time where like you didn't know what was going on. And she passed away, and I had like a split second where I was like, oh, that's really sad and I should cry about that. But she was like in her 90s. She lived a great life, right? And so I bypassed the feeling straight into the logic of why it was okay.
So you rationalize it.
Yeah.
To try to make sense of it.
Yeah. Rather than being able to sit in it. So that's a lot of my own personal work, is to be able to not bypass straight into logic. Or
so how are you impacted when there's people in your life that are very emotive?
it depends on the person. Everything depends on the person. This is like very nuanced.
Think about it like your closest circle, not Aaron, excluding husband, impacted by highly emotive people if they're having a negative emotion or a positive one?
Positive emotions, as you would, I think, as would show for anyone, are maybe a little easier to work through, or, there's not like the exchange of that is different. Although I often am told things like, you don't show any passion. Do you ever get excited about things? If someone else is really excited, I might be excited for them, but it might not be outwardly apparent. If somebody's having an emotion that we would typically classify as negative in some way, I think, and again, dependent on the person, usually I'm okay with it. I'm pretty good at detaching from their emotion. But again, it's very dependent on who it is. There's somebody who's close to me that when they get particularly upset, if I interpret that as something I could have solved or something I could have helped to make better in some way, I will go into this mode of trying to fix it, and I'll get wrapped up in their, not necessarily that I'll have the same negativity or the same anger or the same whatever it is that they're having, but I'll get wrapped up in the, how do I fix this as fast as possible? Because somehow I feel like I should be able to. So
Interesting.
there's that. Other times I can get frustrated, and I'm not always very good at it. And I do have some close friends who probably, some of them compliment me for it because I'll just be like, nope, don't have time for that bullshit today. Like, we're moving on.
I love that
But
about you, by the way. I
yeah,
need
it's
that.
like, uh, but sometimes I think it can come off as like not caring or not empathetic because sometimes there is like the I don't want to play into the moment. If somebody's having a feeling about something and maybe they're super anxious or maybe they're making a lot of excuses for themselves in some sort of way, right? I'll get to a point where like I don't care. Like you do you, I'm done. Like I'm going to do the thing. You decide what you're going to do. But I kind of am like like I get to this like leave me out of it. Like I'm not sure if I'm describing this very well, but
Well, it's a little bit like if you perceive that you have value add to the situation, you'll move through and maybe unpack a little bit more and have a little bit more time to spend in that moment. But I guess, does it resonate if you don't feel that you have something to add?
sometimes it's not even about what I have to add. It's where I sort of lose my patience and maybe could come off not as empathetic as this is their decision and nothing I say or do is going to move them off center. Then I'm just like, I'm done. I'm not going to spend any more energy with you trying to talk you into this because it's a waste of my energy. Like I won't, I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That makes sense. In terms of relationship to time, can you talk about that a
Oh,
bit?
yes. So five's orientation to time is the past. That's definitely true for me. It shows up every day, every day.
Like in the way that you are thinking about what if I had known this or that to help change or manipulate, or like in a way of
Uh,
like that four that can kind of romanticize the past.
it's both for me.
Okay.
So there can be the I should have known XYZ. Had I known, this would have been different. It's the hindsight's 2020, right? Had I known, I could have made a difference here. Had I not said this, I could have made a difference there. You can split that 1,000 ways. It can be replaying conversations of the past and trying to unpack them. I can give you an example from this weekend, even. This is where I mean, like, it's every single day. So we had dinner last night. We had some friends over for dinner. And we get to the end of the evening, and I can't remember exactly what we were talking about. But I sort of woke up this morning with this, I would call it low grade anxiety about, like, huh, I think in that conversation, like maybe I said something I shouldn't have said. I wish I would have phrased that differently. I wish I would have been maybe a little softer. Or I wish I wouldn't have called it out like that.
I have heard you
Uh,
talk about things like that before where you're
yeah,
like, I think I said it wrong. Or I think, yeah, I've heard
yeah.
you talk about that.
Where the intent of something doesn't come across because I maybe said it too directly, or I said it in a not empathetic way, or I don't
Right.
know, I wasn't expressive enough with my face or something like that. So the orientation into the past can happen like that, right? Where it's just like, okay, that was yesterday and I'm still thinking
Yep.
about how I could have been better. But it can also be this like beating myself up for things that happened a long time ago. Like maybe it wasn't yesterday, maybe it's like,
And
high
years ago.
school
Yeah.
or yeah, 10 years ago or and the romanticized part of it comes from things that I either didn't explore all the way to their fullest or maybe where I perceive I gave up too early, like I hit a point of frustration I gave up too early. So then I'll romanticize about what if I had not done that. So the horse, I used to train horses. I think we've touched on that before. But sometimes that'll come up where I'll have this like, oh, if I just would have kept that one, if I just would have followed it through with that one, if I hadn't given up when she was like a monster and I was sick of her, right? If I hadn't just been like, okay, I'm selling this one because I can't take it anymore. What if I had stuck with it? What if I had like that kind of thing?
Sure. So as a five in because I hear what you're saying from the like, oh, maybe I didn't say that with enough empathy or enough emotion tied to it. It's harder for me to, I don't think I've ever had an interaction with you where I've not assumed positive intent. So I can't really speak to a personal experience that I've had where you've just said something and I took it the wrong way. But when that does happen with the people closest to you, what does it feel like for you?
It's so nuanced again. Some people, well, everybody's journey is different. So I've had people misinterpret things and think I was being defensive when I wasn't being when I was genuinely trying to ask a question to understand better, but it was perceived as defensiveness. And that feels terrible because I'm like I don't know how to fix that part of it. Some people I have there's a lot of when we get to eights, I have a lot of eights in my life. And I can think of times where I've been like very direct with certain eights in my life, but they take it so well. It's never because they're very direct, right? They don't get
Well,
offended by
yeah, and
it.
they want that energy matched. Like they
Yeah.
want,
And so even if I'm calling them out,
yeah.
not all the time, but generally they're fine with it.
Hmm.
So, yeah, so it can be really I mean, I don't think anybody likes it when their intent is perceived
Right. I guess
as yeah.
the curiosity for me in it is because if I'm like I just have a lot of empathy for the situation that you could find yourself in where to your point, I'm just saying the thing and I don't know how to change the way that I just said that for you to have read that differently. So I have a lot of empathy for that, I guess. And I think the fives that I know read really, really strong emotionally. So I think that the the times that I have seen a five break down, my two heart breaks into a thousand pieces. But to
Or
that point, I guess if you were talking to the people that are closest to you and you're needing their support, what does their support look like for you when you're down bad? Because you guys show up so strong.
well, generally, and I think it's the one-to-one subtype for me, the support sometimes it's just being there. I don't necessarily need to, sometimes I need to talk through it, but sometimes it's just being there, right? Like there's like a joke about someone will just come sit on the couch and maybe like we'll just not talk, but they're just there. That can be helpful. The other way is that I think that, and I'm not intentionally trying to show up, to use your word there, I'm not intentionally trying to show up, stoic or unemotional, or it just is that's a pattern that has been safe. So, I mean, when you think about kids, right, and we talk about your kids a little bit, I don't have kids, so I can't relate to that exactly, but as someone who was a child at one point, right, I can say that there were things that were said like, don't be so dramatic in my house. Or
Sure.
if I had a big emotion, it was often sort of minimized. And I don't want to say minimized, that's not quite the right word, but it was like, well, calm down. Well, sort of this, that big feeling about whatever it was inappropriate in some way.
Right,
Or
like a seen, not heard in that
yeah,
kind of
yes.
space.
And so that's sort of, so I just learned that even if I was going to have a big feeling about something, I had to approach it I had to come at it from a logical, calm, reserved place to get taken care of.
Yeah, and that's as someone who has young kids now, there's such a focus on social emotional development that, I mean, countless influencers and teachers and online that are talking about how to manage through emotions. And it's sad to think about at one point that that was the message was the feeling isn't comfortable for me, so I don't want you to have it.
Right. This is inconvenient.
This is inconvenient
Yeah.
for me.
Yeah.
Which as a parent, I can relate, like you're trying to get shoes on, you're trying to get out the door, and there's a feeling about a pair of shoes, and you're like, whoa,
Just put your shoes on.
just put your
Yes.
shoes on, we gotta go. But because you have quite a few siblings,
Yes. 3 brothers and a sister.
okay? So, and you're the youngest, right?
No. No, I'm a middle. I'm the second oldest.
Okay. How do you think that influenced you being a 5 with all of those other kids around?
I felt like the oldest most of the time. My sister's 8 years older than I am, and she was gone. Like, she went to a private high school, like, lived like a
Mhm.
boarding school kind of high school when she was 16. She went to school for art, got into this, like, special art school for high
Cool.
school age kids.
Okay.
So, very talented, right? But so from that point on, I felt like the oldest. My We're all roughly 4 years apart, like 3.5, 4 years apart,
That's what I
stair
thought. I
step
was
all
like,
the way down. Yeah.
yeah.
And so between me and the youngest is 10 years, almost exactly. I was born in
Okay.
81. He was born in 91.
Okay.
But I felt kind of at the time where you start to really have like a lot of things going on as a kid, that 8 to 12, I felt like the oldest. I felt like the one that had to be responsible for them, take care of them. You know, my parents were running a farm and a business and so there was like this element of responsibility that I felt fell to me for them.
I think that's a really good point to bring up in relation to your responsibilities that you had because people always assume that that nurturing kind of need or the necessity of that reads very two. And it's a really good point to think about how even in a situation like that, it doesn't always show up like 2 energy. It can be 5 energy. It can be like each
Yeah,
individual decides how they're going to make it through that upbringing safely.
right.
So you
Yeah,
bring up a Great point.
Yeah, and I don't have when we get to tri-type, my feels like is a 4. But like
Mm-hmm.
we've talked about on the IEQ 9, like you can see sort of how you are across all the numbers. And my 4 and 2 are actually very close in terms of the
Okay.
feels like.
Okay.
Um, but I identify more with the 4 feels like because it is internal, whereas twos
Sure.
have a little more external feeling. Also, with it being a wing, there's a little more of that, just that energy there.
Mhm.
But it's interesting because I never felt like the responsibility that I had in my family would get me love, right? So it's like the motivation is totally different to your point. Twos are like, I must be helpful. So they would take on the responsibility because I must be helpful in order to be valued by my family. And for
Mhm.
me, it was like, I have all of this responsibility just because. Like it was happenstance of the age that I was, the situation that we grew up in. And I never was like, oh, if I'm super helpful, they'll love me more. It was always a little bit more of the how do I stay quiet and smart enough?
Right. When you are at your healthiest, what does that look like for you being a 5? What are the patterns that you notice when you're at your healthiest?
When I'm in my healthiest, and when we talk about lines, some of this will make more sense, but when I'm in my healthiest, I think I can show up a little bit more commanding presence. It isn't so quiet anymore. It's a little more outwardly what people would describe as confident. And it's not ever that I'm not. There are times where I'm not confident. It shouldn't say that I'm not never confident, but sometimes the quietness reads as a lack of confidence when it's not really a lack of confidence. But when I'm at my healthiest, it's outward, like it's more apparent. It also, I think when I'm in a really good space, I'm able to take action quickly, right? In the unhealthy pattern, it's like a rumination of just sitting on it and thinking about it, thinking about it, thinking about it, and maybe never actually moving the thing forward. So the healthy space is being able to take action on the thing that I've been thinking about.
Okay. So flip that. I've heard some stories that you've shared about when you're in a stressful spot, but can you share maybe an example of what that looks like when you're stressed?
When I'm stressed. When I'm stressed, I get very scattered. Like I will all of a sudden, I might be taking actions, but I'm not actually finishing anything. So that's a distinction, right? There's the healthy action where you're moving something forward in a productive way. And then there's the action that's like busyness for the sake of busyness. And so when I'm very stressed, it'll be that. It's busyness for the sake of busyness. It'll also be, I will get very impulsive about projects. And they're not like little projects, like big projects. Like let's tear down walls in the house or refinish floors or I don't know, things like that. Yeah, so there's some action orientation behind that, but it's I don't want to call it wrong action, but the motivation of the action is actually avoidant in those cases. Right? Because I'm
Right.
avoiding a feeling. I'm feeling stressed. I don't want to feel stressed. I'm going to find something to do to get out of it.
The busyness is to avoid the feeling.
Yes. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Or I don't want to be alone with myself. Right. So stay super busy.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. What is the best advice that you can give somebody who maybe just discovered that they are a 5?
Oh, that's a good question. I think if you are just learning the Enneagram, you just learned you're a 5. The first thing is don't allow that to justify the less than positive traits about a 5, or don't let it justify see, I'm an introvert.
Right, like
Um,
the excuse of,
yeah,
"Well, here's how I show up and here's why, so, like, it is what it is." Yeah.
it is. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's the first thing because that can be super easy, especially because you can feel seen and valued. And we talked about that in our first episode where we talked about when I took the test and I was like, holy crap, I think there's someone living it, like watching me. This is so accurate. But it
Also,
is,
right?
yeah, right. It is really about like recognizing the patterns? How do you develop awareness? That's what I would say is like, how do you develop awareness around the behavioral patterns and the places where you're avoidant, where you should lean in? And I think that's really important because it can be more comfortable to go to the place of, well, I'm a 5. This is how I am.
Well, it's putting a limit on yourself.
Yeah.
It's actively putting yourself in a box, which is the opposite of the intent.
Yes, the exact opposite. Even though sometimes that might feel comfortable or it might feel like, well, this is a valid excuse. Right.
Yeah, right.
So it's not valid, by the way, for any number.
I actually thought of you through so we just found out my 6-year-old needs glasses. Holly knows this story, but I thought of you when I was going through that process because we get the evidence, right? Of like from school. Hey, he's saying that the board's blurry, right?
Yeah.
That immediately translates into a feeling for me. Like, I'm frustrated because I think you're lying, Keegan. But also, it made me feel like, oh no, it's like a thing he's going to have to go through. And I feel so bad for him. And like that really high 2 feeling energy was kicking in. And I actually had a moment of reflection before the appointment of like, just be logical, like just channel that Holly 5 energy of like, this is an answer. Like we're going to get an answer one way or another today. And it is what it is. And I can't do anything to change it.
Yeah. We're going to solve the problem. The board is not going to be blurry anymore.
We're going to solve the problem. But I needed to move very quickly through the feeling of, oh my gosh, I feel so bad for him because he was super excited. Like, this is cool. So that was a moment of it, because it is definitely a superpower from the way that I see it, specifically where you have the ability to think logically through something without an emotion making it more cloudy.
The flip side of that, though, is that, well, like the emotion gets bypassed.
Right. And you don't work through.
Sure. And you don't work through
Yeah.
that. So there's that. There's also a part of where in the bypassing of the emotion, you miss like a key piece of information that you actually need.
Oh, well, that's good advice for a 5. If you explore the emotion, you might find a nugget of evidence that you need.
Yes. Yeah, I think
there's the carrot, 5s.
Yeah, there's the carrot. Well, and I wanted to make sure, I remembered what I was going to say before. I wanted to make sure, we've talked about, I think I hinted at it in one of the previous episodes about like why choosing the IEQ 9. And for me, choosing the IEQ 9 was like a very 5 reason. The IEQ 9 as a test, one, it was developed by a 5. If you didn't know that, it was developed by a 5. Who was challenged, by the way. He was learning the Enneagram in the narrative tradition and from these kind of teachers that teach the narrative tradition of the Enneagram, which has its place 100%. They were like, well, no one will ever be able to make an assessment for the Enneagram that's accurate because of how difficult it is to measure someone's motivation. And of course, the 5 response in that was a little bit of like, well, just watch me. And so he developed the IEQ 9 and continues to refine it, in terms of how that works to have an accurate test. And they are considered like 95 to 98% accurate across multiple different languages at this point. So that's one reason that the IEQ 9 resonated with me and why I chose that tool to get certified in, as opposed to a narrative tradition or the Enneagram Institute has an assessment as well, or that assessment or whatever. So I did want to touch on that because, of course, it was a 5. But one of the things that he talked about in the certification, he talked to our class, and he talked about the learning his 5-ness and recognizing this sort of bypassing of feelings and needing to do the work to be like a full, well-rounded human meant that he had to learn how to feel and also how to read the feelings as bits of information. So to that point, he talks about at the same time he was kind of learning the Enneagram and learning about his 5-ness. He was also reading a book called A Course in Miracles. I don't know if people are familiar with that. And that also helped him come through that. But yeah, it's because there are things I definitely have missed. I've logicked my way out of red flag feelings, for example,
Oh,
in
sure.
relationships where maybe really early on in a situation, I knew my feelings were telling me something was off, but my brain was like, well, you don't actually know what's going on. Like, you don't know that person. You don't know their story. You don't need to know their situation. That feeling is stupid. Logically, you have no evidence to support the feeling you're having.
Right.
So, therefore, I would ignore it. And then I would end up down the road with the person, sometimes a couple of years into a relationship, and then it would become painfully obvious. Like, oh, like that feeling I had way back. Yeah, I should have listened to that.
Saying, all right, what else? What do you,
Well, what are the things you want to call out about a five?
I think aside from the things that I shared about listening and how that feels and how it resonates for me, having some fives in my life, you're the closest five that I have to me that I'm aware of. And I would also say that I think the comfort that I find in a five is it's a little bit of like yin to my yang energy where I have this like really big, bold feeling and I like just say shit. It just kind of falls out of my mouth. And I've found safe spaces in fives that don't feel judgmental, that feel really open and curious, that have brought out more of a curiosity in me to become more well rounded. Because it's a modeling of that behavior of genuine curiosity that I love about a five. It's just that genuine feeling of why is that thing the way that it is, or why do I do this way? And modeling that curiosity even through the things I've learned about myself in the Enneagram is what's been helpful. So no pressure for you. I just I
I won't take that
I
as pressure.
model that curiosity because I think it's so amazing and it gives you so much insight that you wouldn't have had you not been genuinely curious.
Yeah.
And sometimes, I mean, you know this about me, when I'm curious about something and I find something I wasn't planning on finding, I also then need a five to unpack that. Okay, I got curious about the thing. I found this. Wasn't expecting that. I
Yeah.
need to I need to talk through what that feels like for me.
Feels like.
But I would also call out that another five that I have in my life is really motivated to being better and making the people around them better. And that's something that I love too, because it's kind of this relentless search for betterment. And that really is really, really helpful for me when I get caught up in especially something that's negative. It helps me support through the curiosity of the negativity and how it could be better. And I've seen it be really impactful for other fives. And you've impacted me in more ways than one about just being genuinely curious on my two-ness and where that shows up. And we talk, like you mentioned, we talk about Brandon in every
Yeah.
episode at this point. But in doing that deep work too, and me being genuinely curious, modeling that curiosity of why has gotten me so much more integrated
Yeah.
into other numbers and feeling more confident in why I show up the way that I do.
The work there has been impactful for me in terms of there is a, so we talked about when I'm problem solving, I go through my list of logical things and this
Yeah.
and this and this.
Yeah. Yeah.
But doing that work with him has actually calmed some of that down to a little bit more of, well, here's what you can control. Here's what you can't control.
So it's acceptance.
It's acceptance that's different. So I have actually, I think we talked about this a little bit, and we'll talk about sixes in more depth next week. And Tana's a thinks like a six, and I have a six wing. But I would say that that six wing used to come, that six worst case scenario planning kind of behavior used to show up for me much, much stronger than it does today. And I think that a lot of that shift has been that deeper work with Brandon to now into the point of our talking about, 5 energy and conserving it and all of that. Now there's an energy conservation in not spending the energy in that space. That feels a lot better.
Yeah, that's a weight lifted off for sure. I'm still very much in the process of trying to understand my thinks like a 6. Brandon and I are just kind of starting to uncover some work of where that might have come from, where I didn't necessarily even consider that energy could be coming from there. But it's hopefully going to be a little bit more relief coming up for me of not having to plan for, and I mean, kids just made me double down on that feeling. So have you ever heard about people referencing our generation as like the bedroom generation, where like kids would play in their bedrooms?
Oh,
So,
sure. Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, I guess I have heard that.
In the family room. So Keegan, as of late, has started like first thing when he gets home from school, he will go upstairs to his room. And he's got some like sensory stuff that he gets really overstimulated in big environments like that. So part of it is like just him decompressing. But I thought about 5 energy with him recently because of that, because he genuinely likes to unpack and play by himself. So, of course, me being a 2, I'm imposing myself on him. I'm like, hey, why don't you come downstairs and play? You can do that over here, and I can watch you, or I can play with you. Or he's like, I just want to be here by myself. I'm like, are you feeling okay?
So my sister is, I'm on the cusp of millennial and Gen X. But my sister is solidly Gen X, but my brothers are all solidly millennials.
Millennial. Yeah.
I'm trying to remember. We did play a lot in our rooms. There were so many of us though. Like we didn't have like a public play place.
Like an open space that could be for that. Yeah.
Yeah, there wasn't like a playroom. Every room was a person's actual room. So we played in each other's rooms, unless it was like a family board game or something like that.
So since I've learned that, I've become like hypersensitive to does he need to unpack all of that by himself because he's a 5? He's still giving 3 energy. I'm not. Not that big of a secret that he's probably going to be a 3. And we had his parent-teacher conference last week where she's so sweet. She's been teaching forever, and she's like, he's just so kind, and he talks to everyone. Like, he doesn't have he's with everybody. I'm like, oh, there's that 3 with a 2 wing.
Yeah. Probably a social subtype.
Oh, yeah.
I'm excited to actually deep dive on subtypes. I know we talked about it but I think the nuance of that is fun to unpack with the Enneagram.
It is. It's really fun. And I remember when I was just learning through, I had just gotten certified. I think I came to you and I was like, I think I'm triggered by everyone who's self-preservation. And you're like, well, I don't think that's true.
Well, I think, because you're not self-preservation. I'm not self-preservation. So some of it is, it is like a not full understanding of it maybe too, right? But I mentioned before that as a 1-to-1 5, I'm the counter type of 5, because that 1-to-1 subtype energy is sort of opposite of the core part of being a 5. But self-preservation 5s I call them the 5est 5s.
Okay.
Because the self-preservation subtype like kind of locks them down even more into their own world, making sure that they're okay, making sure that they're independent, making sure they've got all their needs met, right? So it like doubles down that energy.
I think the self-preservation trigger for me, I've learned a little bit that in my 2-ness, it might be because that person doesn't need me, or the perception is they don't want me.
Yeah, do not need your help. I can take care of it myself. Yes. Yeah.
I think that might be it for me. But to your point, I'm excited to talk through subtypes. But one question I had about a social 5 is, so that would read for them like they are serving the broader population and what the broader population needs from them in that moment.
Yeah, the social 5, well, the social any social subtype
Mm-hmm.
perceives themselves as part of a community or part of a group, and they're trying to serve or play a role in the community or group. And for 5s, it can come through like knowledge to a group,
Sure.
right? Or the research, like maybe it's even like the volunteering to do like the researchy based things that the group needs. And that's the value that then they bring to the group they're or community they're a part of. But it's yeah, and for every social subtype takes their number and has a spin on that. So for social 2, right, it's this is my place in the community. How do I help and serve my community through that lens?
Okay.
Where a social 1, it comes through like, how do I make this group that I'm a part of more perfect?
Yep.
Yeah. And social threes are the threeest threes. And so it sort of, I'm going to bring my competitive edge to this group. And that's the value that I bring, is to help everyone be more competitive or win
Yeah.
as a group or whatever it is. Yeah.
Next
That's just
week,
next week's 6s. That was just a
next
little,
week is
little
6,
subtype tangent.
but I love a subtype tangent. That's going to be some long episodes, I think. You're going to have your work cut out for you editing. But I think I'm excited to talk through 6s. For those of you who are new listeners, please chat with us. We want to hear more about what you think. Holly, this was great. I love a
Yeah.
5, and thanks for sharing your perspective on that. Excited to talk about 6s, and we'll move our way through the rest of the numbers from a deeper dive perspective. But don't forget to find us on social. And what else would you add, Holly?
Yeah. You can find us on all the socials, and all the links for that will
Socials.
be either in the show notes, or if you're watching this on YouTube, it'll be in the YouTube description. But also, like Tannah mentioned, like, subscribe, leave a review, leave us some comments. We love that. Do you have questions? Is there something you want to know about number or type, or something come up for you that you would like us to cover in more depth? We would love to do that. So any interaction that you have, super helpful. All right, cool. Next week,
Well,
6s.
thanks, Holly. Thanks for
Yeah.
unpacking your 5ness, and I love every second of it. So
Yeah.
thank you, and we'll chat 6s next week.
Yeah. Sounds good. Talk to you later.
Okay, see ya.